The wind that night carried no song, only the low groan of trees bending beneath a pale, indifferent moon. Out in the vast rural quiet of Nebraska, where fields stretched in endless sheets of black, and the roads seemed swallowed by silence, one man simply ceased to exist. His name was Michael Carr, 34 years old, a federal agent with the kind of presence that neighbors called steady, though his colleagues whispered he had the eyes of someone who never quite slept. He lived in a small clapboard house on the edge of town, where gravel roads gave way to endless farmland. On the surface, his life was unremarkable work home, late-night cigarettes smoked on the porch, with the crickets rasping around him. But on the night of November the 2nd, 1991, that quiet normalcy ruptured, and the man who had built his life on discipline and secrecy walked into the dark, never to return. The evening had been cold enough that his breath clouded in the air, but not yet winter's full bite. Diesel fumes lingered faintly near the depot downtown, mingling with the metallic tang of rust that rose from the old rail tracks. It was the kind of night where sound travelled oddly far footsteps, echoing sharper dogs barking miles away as though just outside your door. Those who saw Michael last described him as calm, methodical, though something in the way he carried himself betrayed an urgency. He had been seen fueling his government-issued sedan at a lone gas station, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead, casting shadows that twitched across his face. He paid in cash. He did not speak. Hours later, his car was found abandoned along a dirt road outside of town, the headlights off the keys still in the ignition. The engine was cold. The door on the driver's side hung slightly ajar, as if left in haste. Beyond it stretched fields of brittle stalks, the kind that rustled even without wind, whispering in low tones that unsettled anyone who passed. The first thought in the small community was denial. Surely Michael had stepped into the field for some simple reason, a walk, a sudden phone call, a moment to himself. Surely he would be back. After all, disappearances like this belong to city alleyways, not to the flat, endless farms of the Midwest. But the hours bled into dawn, and the car remained lifeless as stone. By morning, suspicion had replaced denial. Locals muttered about strange vehicles spotted in the area that week. Boxy vans without plates, men who didn't speak when asked for directions. Others whispered of Michael's job and agent, but never clear about which branch. His work carried a shadow, the kind of silence that told you it was not safe to ask questions. Some claimed he had been investigating something, though no one seemed to know what. Others said he had confided in no one, not even family, about the details of his work. The mystery of his vanishing deepened with each passing hour. Search teams combed the fields, their flashlights sweeping across stalks that rattled like bones. They called his name into the night, but the sound died quickly, absorbed by the vast emptiness. Dogs were brought in their noses, tracing a path into the farmland, only to halt abruptly, circling, as if the trail had been cut clean off. It was as though Michael had been swallowed whole by the earth itself. The community's unease grew heavy. People began locking their doors earlier, the quiet of rural nights no longer comforting, but suffocating. The sound of a lone knock at the door, once a neighborly gesture, became a source of dread. Even the air carried a weight thick with the mildew of autumn leaves decaying in ditches, a smell that seemed to cling to every piece of clothing worn by those who searched. Weeks stretched into months. Posters faded on telephone poles. His family's faces hollowed with grief, their words growing shorter, clipped by exhaustion. His colleagues, federal men in pressed suits, arrived, but their questions were terse, their presence cold. They set up in the local sheriff's office, whispered behind closed doors, then left as suddenly as they came. They never shared their findings. By the winter of 1992, the case had grown cold. Snow buried the fields, muting every sound into a soft, endless silence. The search was called off. Michael Carr was listed as missing, presumed dead. But no body was found, no trace, no sign of struggle. His existence seemed to have evaporated into the ether. For 30 years, the story became less of a case, and more of a ghost tale whispered in that Nebraska town. Children dared each other to walk the road where his car had been found, listening for the faint click of footsteps in the frost. Farmers swore they heard knocking in their barns at night, though no one was ever there. Families kept their curtains closed after dark, the fields beyond their windows, feeling less like home, more like a presence waiting to step forward. Then, in 2021, everything changed. A boy 14 years old, the son of a farmer who had recently purchased land not far from where Michael's car had been found, wandered into the woods at the edge of the property. The day was humid, the air carrying the stagnant stink of swamp water that collected in shallow pools after heavy rain. Mosquitoes buzzed thick as smoke, and the boy, sweating in the August heat, pushed through the trees until he stumbled upon something buried beneath years of moss and soil. At first, it looked like nothing more than rusted metal, a corroded fragment of farm equipment long forgotten. But as he knelt and brushed away the earth, he uncovered something else, a badge, its surface pitted and darkened by time, but still unmistakable. The boy held it in his hands, the letters faint but visible: Federal Agent. News of the discovery spread like wildfire. For the first time in decades, the story of Michael Carr resurfaced, dragging with it all the unease that had never truly left the town. Investigators returned their vehicles, kicking up dust along roads that hadn't seen such traffic in years. The land was searched again, every tree and ditch examined, and within weeks more was found fragments of clothing buried deep in the soil fibers that matched what Michael had been wearing the night he vanished. But with each discovery came more questions. The placement of the badge, the location of the clothing. It was as if someone had carefully arranged these things to be found decades later, waiting for the right eyes to stumble upon them. The boy who found the badge later told his parents he had heard something that day, just before he uncovered it. A sound he couldn't describe, like whispers threading through the trees, words he couldn't quite understand. He said the air had felt colder, the shadows thicker, as though the forest itself had been holding its breath. And for the community, all the dread they had buried for 30 years came rushing back. The badge was taken into evidence, sealed in a clear bag beneath harsh fluorescent light at the county sheriff's office. But even there, behind locked doors, it seemed to radiate unease. Deputies swore it carried a smell subtle but unmistakable, like damp earth mixed with something acrid, diesel fumes clinging stubbornly to old metal. They joked nervously about it at first, but no one wanted to be the one to move it, to touch it again. The boy who had unearthed it could not sleep for nights afterward. He described dreams that came heavy and suffocating, dreams of standing in those woods again, with the badge half buried in mud, the air filled with a low droning, like insects humming inside his skull. In the dreams, he always felt someone standing behind him, close enough to touch, though he never dared turn. His parents dismissed it as fear, but when he began waking with his sheets damp and cold, as though carried from the outside night, they began to worry. The town itself seemed to shift under the weight of the discovery. Old residents who had learned to let silence swallow Michael Carr's disappearance found their thoughts returning to it at odd moments. Some remembered details: they had buried cars without headlights, lingering too long at crossroads, the faint thump of boots outside their barns when no one was there. The unease wove itself into daily life. Farmers working their fields reported hearing the crunch of footsteps pacing the edge of their property, always just beyond view. Dogs, once lazy in their yards, barked at empty corners until their voices cracked raw. Investigators combed the wooded lot where the badge was found. Ground-penetrating radar was brought in its mechanical whine, cutting across the fields. And there, beneath 6 feet of earth, they uncovered a series of small anomalies, disturbances in the soil places where the ground had once been opened, then closed again. They began digging the wet earth, clinging to shovels, the air growing colder as the hole deepened. What emerged first was fabric blackened and brittle with age. Then came a fragment of leather warped by damp, its stitching faint but visible, a shoe, and then bone. It was only partial, fragile pieces discolored by time and soil, but tests would later confirm what many had already feared: human remains. Though it would take months to officially link them to Michael Carr, the discovery was enough to resurrect the nightmare in full. Yet something about the scene unsettled even the hardened investigators. The bones were not scattered, not the chaotic remains of someone abandoned in haste. They were positioned, laid in a way that suggested deliberation, the body once placed with intention. But missing pieces told a darker story. The skull was gone. Certain bones of the hands and feet were absent as well, their absence impossible to attribute to simple decay. Whoever had placed him there had taken parts of him with them. Rumors surged like wildfire. Some whispered of cults, of strange gatherings in the countryside during the early 90s that had never been fully investigated. Others speculated that Michael had crossed the wrong line in his work, and those responsible had not only killed him, but performed something ritualistic afterward, a message buried as carefully as his body. The boy who had discovered the badge became a strange figure in the community. Some regarded him with awe, as though fate had chosen him to reopen a story long left dormant. Others avoided him, whispering that he had stirred something best left buried. He himself grew quieter, his eyes always restless, scanning shadows as though expecting them to move. Then came the second discovery. 3 weeks after the remains were unearthed, a farmer less than 2 miles from the site reported a foul smell seeping up from his well. At first he thought it was a dead animal, but when workers were called to investigate, what they pulled from the depths was not an animal at all. Wrapped in decayed burlap was a set of personal effects, a wallet, the leather eaten through but still holding faded identification cards, a holster with a rusted weapon inside, and a small notebook whose pages had fused together, blackened by water and time. The name inside the wallet, smeared but still legible, was Michael Carr. The discovery should have brought relief, closure. Instead, it deepened the abyss. Because the notebook, though ruined, contained fragments of writing that could still be read. Words scrawled in hurried ink, half sentences that seemed to end abruptly. They know, and not safe even here. And one phrase repeated twice, underlined so hard the paper had nearly torn: the field is listening. That phrase spread through the town like a sickness. Children repeated it on playgrounds, their voices lilting like a rhyme. Adults tried to dismiss it, but the more they spoke it, the heavier it felt, as though the fields themselves strained closer, ears pressed to the earth. In the weeks following the discovery of the notebook, strange reports multiplied. Residents claimed their phones carried static whenever they drove past the site where Michael's car had once been found. Others said radios caught bursts of whispering on empty frequencies, voices layered over each other in tones too low to decipher. One man, a night watchman at a grain elevator, swore he saw a figure standing in the distance one foggy night, tall and unmoving, until it simply wasn't there anymore. He quit the next morning, leaving his post without notice. The investigators grew restless. Some admitted privately that the evidence did not add up. Michael Carr's remains had been found in one place, his belongings in another. Neither seemed like the true scene of death, but rather pieces scattered deliberately, as though whoever had orchestrated this disappearance had wanted the story to unfold in stages. The unease built to panic when the farmer's son, the boy who had discovered the badge, went missing. It happened in September of 2021, just weeks after school began. He was last seen walking home at dusk, the air heavy with the smell of rain-soaked soil. His backpack was found abandoned at the edge of the same woods where he had unearthed the badge. Inside was his lunchbox, unopened, and a sketchbook. On the last page, pressed hard into the paper, was a drawing of fields under a dark sky, and at the center, a shadow with no face. Search teams scoured the land, but just as it had 30 years before, the trail ended, abruptly vanishing into nothing. Dogs circled in confusion. Volunteers called until their voices broke. And once again, the Nebraska fields swallowed a life whole. This time, the town did not simply mourn, they feared. For many, the conclusion became inescapable. Michael Carr's disappearance had not been a solitary tragedy. Something lingered in those fields, something patient, something that waited. And now it had returned. The search for the missing boy stretched through September and into October, the season slowly stripping colour from the fields. Cornstalks browned and collapsed brittle against the advancing cold. The air grew sharper, the nights longer, and with each passing day, the hope of finding him alive thinned like smoke. But unlike the disappearance of Michael Carr 30 years before this time, the eyes of the state turned sharply toward the small Nebraska town. Satellite trucks appeared along the main road, journalists swarming with their cameras, and clipped voices demanding answers the community did not have. The once quiet streets pulsed with an uneasy energy, headlights flashing across porches deep into the night. Federal investigators arrived as well, their black SUVs rolling in at dawn tires crunching gravel. They set up in the sheriff's office, commandeering a room that had once stored boxes of old case files. This time their presence was heavier, less like observers, more like occupiers. They opened crates of documents that had been sealed for decades. Inside were files marked with Michael Carr's name, his photograph clipped to the front, his eyes tired, even in black and white. The townspeople watching through the windows as agents moved quickly inside could not help but wonder, had they been holding something back all these years? The truth trickled out like water through cracked stone. Michael Carr, it was said, had been investigating a series of disappearances in the Midwest in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Cases that never made headlines because they were scattered, isolated farmhands who vanished after late shifts, travelers whose cars were found abandoned near dirt roads, children who went missing along county lines. Each case had been written off as a runaway, an accident, a tragedy unconnected to the others. But Carr had begun to notice patterns, threads, binding them together. The most disturbing detail: nearly all the cases occurred near wide, flat farmland. Fields. One of the agents, speaking too loudly in the sheriff's office late one night, let slip a phrase that townsfolk later carried to each other in hushed tones. Carr's final report, unfinished when he disappeared, bore a title at the top of the page: "The field is listening." It was the same phrase found underlined in his ruined notebook. The investigators denied knowing what it meant. They insisted the files were incomplete, that no one could prove Carr had even written them. But the town remembered. They remembered the way sound carried strangely at night, how footsteps echoed in empty fields, how dogs refused to cross certain patches of land. They remembered the boy's last drawing, a faceless shadow in a field. The parents of the missing boy sat in silence at the town hall meetings, their grief too raw to shape into words. The father, a broad man weathered by years of farm work, spoke only once. He said that the night before his son vanished, the boy had come to him pale and shaking, saying he heard voices in the corn. Not voices that spoke in sentences, but whispers that seemed to repeat his name again and again, growing louder if he tried to ignore them. The father had brushed it off, thinking it was just the imagination of a boy who'd been spooked by too many stories. Now his silence felt like complicity. In the weeks after the boy's disappearance, search teams discovered something else. Half a mile from the woods, buried just beneath the frost-hardened ground, they unearthed a piece of cloth-torn denim that matched the boy's jeans. But the way it was found unsettled them. It wasn't weather-worn or scattered by animals. It was folded, neatly, placed as though by a careful hand. The detail echoed Michael Carr's remains, arranged, not abandoned. Whispers of ritual resurfaced. Some said Carr had uncovered something he wasn't supposed to, not criminals in the ordinary sense, but something older, something that thrived in silence and secrecy. Others wondered if the fields themselves, with their endless expanse and strange acoustics, weren't simply witnesses, but participants hungry, patient, capable of consuming. The weather worsened as October waned. Winds swept across the plains with a howl that rattled barn doors and slammed shutters. Farmers swore. The wind carried words, snatches of broken phrases that disintegrated when listened to directly. At night, the temperature dropped fast, the air so cold it burned the lungs, yet in the woods where the badge had been found, The air always seemed warmer, humid, even like breath too close to the skin. By late October, the federal team working in the sheriff's office reported their first break. They had uncovered recordings, cassette tapes found among Carr's personal effects, mislabeled in an evidence box that had sat untouched for 3 decades. On the tapes was Carr's voice, low and steady, though at times shaking. He described late-night drives through the countryside, pulling over with his headlights off to listen. He spoke of hearing patterns in the wind voices layered in frequencies just beyond comprehension. He claimed he was being followed not by men, but by something that moved with the crops bending stalks though there was no breeze. On the last tape, his voice grew frantic. He said he had to act quickly, that they were getting closer. He repeated one phrase over and over again. "It knows when you speak its name." Then came silence, punctuated by the faint crackle of static, and then a sound, faint but distinct, knocks. 3 of them slow and deliberate, as though someone was rapping on the outside of his car door. The tape ended there. The discovery unsettled even the agents, but when locals pressed them for answers, they dismissed it as paranoia, the ramblings of a man unraveling under stress. Yet at night, in bars and kitchens, the townsfolk whispered that Carr had not been unraveling, he had been recording a warning. Halloween approached, and with it a tension that gripped the community. Parents kept their children indoors, leaving porches dark. The fields lay bare stalks harvested, leaving only vast open stretches of dirt. And in that emptiness the land seemed even more watchful, as if stripped of its cover, its attention turned fully to those who dared walk it. On October 30th, just before midnight, a deputy patrolling near the woods reported hearing a scream. He swore it came from the trees, sharp and sudden, then cut off mid-breath. He radioed for backup, his voice breaking, but by the time help arrived, the woods were silent. They searched for hours, but nothing was found. That night, the deputy resigned. He told his wife he would not spend another hour patrolling land that listens back. The disappearance of the boy remained unsolved. The remains of Michael Carr stayed incomplete, his skull still missing. And the phrase he had written, the phrase he had recorded, echoed in every whispered conversation, "The field is listening." And as November's cold settled in, the town came to believe what many had long feared: whatever had taken Michael Carr 30 years ago had not finished. It was still here, patient, waiting. November brought a heavier silence, the kind that did not feel like absence, but like pressure. The fields lay stripped, the last of the harvest hauled away, leaving only miles of black soil stretching under the weight of a pale, cold sky. Without the rustle of crops, the land seemed more exposed, more vulnerable, and yet more watchful. Every sound, an owl, a coyote, the crack of frozen dirt, seemed magnified, bouncing across the emptiness, until it was impossible to know where it had come from. It was during this suffocating quiet that a final box was discovered in the federal archives. Misfiled, mislabeled, overlooked for 30 years, it carried Michael Carr's handwriting across its lid. Private, do not release. Inside were notes, photographs, and maps scrawled with thick black lines. The notes were meticulous, documenting every disappearance Carr had tracked across the Midwest. Each victim had been last seen near fields. He had drawn red circles on county maps, Nebraska, Iowa, Kansas, Missouri patterns that spiraled like constellations across farmland. And at the center of one of these circles, underlined so hard the paper had torn, was the very town where he himself had vanished. Among the documents was a letter never mailed. Addressed to his sister, its words trembled with desperation. "I cannot explain it without sounding mad, but you must believe me. This is not men, not criminals. The fields themselves are part of it. The soil, the air, the silence. They hear us. They respond. When people go missing, they are not taken away. They are absorbed. The land itself holds them. I'm close to proving it, but if I fail, if I vanish, remember, do not speak of it aloud. Speaking gives it shape. Speaking makes it listen." The letter ended abruptly, the ink smudged as though his pen had slipped in haste. There were photographs too, grainy black and white images of empty fields at night. At first they seemed meaningless, just dirt stalks, shadows. But in the corners of some faint shapes lingered. Blurs that looked too tall, too narrow to be trees. Smears of white that seemed like faces without features caught mid-turn before dissolving into the darkness. When investigators spread these documents across the sheriff's desk, the air in the room grew heavy. Even hardened men trained to disassemble evidence from superstition shifted uncomfortably. No one wanted to touch the photographs for long. And then there was the final page. A torn sheet from Carr's notebook tucked into the box, as though hidden at the last second. On it, in large, uneven letters, was written, "They took the skulls first. They listened through the bones. The agents locked the documents away, forbidding their release. But word leaked, as it always does. And once spoken, the town could not unspeak it." The phrase itself seemed to linger in the air, whispered from mouth to mouth. They listened through the bones. That November nights became unbearable. Farmers heard knocking from the earth beneath their barns, not on the doors, not on the walls beneath. Dogs refused to cross fields, their bodies stiff, their growls guttural. Families reported hearing their names whispered through static whenever they turned on radios, even with no signal. The missing boy was still gone. Search parties grew smaller, their hope eroded. His mother stood at the edge of the woods one afternoon, staring into the bare branches. When asked what she was looking for, she answered only, "He's not gone. He's still here. Can't you feel it?" And though no one dared say it aloud, many had begun to feel the same. The town held one last desperate meeting in the church basement, the air thick with mildew and the faint sweetness of old hymnals. Federal agents stood stiff at the back, their presence heavy, their eyes watchful. A retired farmer, grey and bent with age, raised his voice above the murmur. He said he remembered 1991. He said he had seen men in the fields at night, men with lanterns moving in deliberate patterns, circling as though marking boundaries. He swore Michael Carr had spoken to him, had asked if he had heard it too, the way the earth sometimes knocked back when you struck it. The church went silent. The farmer's voice cracked as he finished. "If the field listens, then it's already heard us. And if it's already heard us, then it knows we're here." 2 days later, something was found. At the base of a tree in the woods where the badge had been discovered, searchers uncovered a small bundle wrapped in burlap. Inside was a child's shoe, mud-caked but unmistakably belonging to the missing boy, and with it, a fragment of bone small enough to fit in a man's palm. But it was not the boy's. Tests confirmed it was decades old. It belonged to Michael Carr. The realization spread like fire the land had offered a trade. It had given a piece of Carr back in exchange for the boy. By winter, the federal agents packed their things and left. They gave no closure, no explanation. The official line remained ongoing investigation. But the townspeople knew there would be no answers from men in suits. Whatever had taken Michael, whatever had swallowed the boy, was not something that could be documented in a file or sealed in evidence. It was not gone. It was still here. The land returned to silence. Snow fell, blanketing the fields, muting the whispers beneath. But every knock at a barn door, every echo carried strangely across the plains, carried new weight. 30 years after Michael Carr walked into the dark, the truth had never been closer, and yet never more terrifying. Because the clearer it became, the more it was understood his disappearance had not been an ending. It had been the beginning of something that was still unfolding. And as the boy's mother whispered through her tears, staring into the fields that stretched endless and cold, "They don't take you away. They keep you. The field remembers." Snow deepened through December, swallowing the land in silence. The fields, stripped bare in autumn, now lay under white drifts that stretched to the horizon. To anyone passing through the town, looked ordinary, just another lonely Midwestern place tucked against the vastness of sky and soil. But those who lived there knew better. They knew the ground beneath the snow was not empty. It listened. The boy was never found. His absence hung heavier than the winter air, saturating every home. Neighbors left meals on the grieving family's porch, but no one lingered long. Even the kindest among them confessed quietly that it was not just grief that kept them away. It was the sense that the family was marked, touched by something the rest of them feared might spread. Christmas passed without joy. The church bells rang hollow, their echoes lost in the wind. The mother, pale and thin, stopped attending services altogether. Some nights, she was seen walking barefoot along the edge of the woods, her hair tangled with frost, her lips moving as though speaking to someone only she could see. When asked, she would not answer. And then on the first week of January, a final discovery was made. A farmer clearing brush on the far edge of his property noticed something protruding from the frozen earth. At first he thought it was a branch, thick and curved. But when he struck it with his boot, the ground gave way, and what emerged sent him staggering back. It was a skull. The sheriff's office descended quickly, followed by federal agents summoned from across the state. The skull was carefully unearthed, lifted into the frigid air beneath a dim sun. Its surface was discolored, worn by time, but still intact. Tests confirmed what many had dreaded. It belonged to Michael Carr. At last, after 30 years, his skull had surfaced. But there was something wrong. The bone was carved. Along the crown, etched deep into the surface, were parallel grooves, deliberate and symmetrical, as though made by tools. And within those grooves, packed tightly, even after decades underground, was soil, dark, damp, and smelling faintly of mildew and rust. The investigators sealed it away, but rumors bled through. Some claimed the grooves formed patterns, symbols no one could decipher. Others swore they were not symbols at all, but channels designed to carry sound. A vessel through which the land itself could listen. The revelation struck the town like a final blow. If Carr's skull had been altered, shaped deliberately, then his disappearance had never been random. He had not simply been killed. He had been used. The phrase returned with new force. They listened through the bones. After the skull was found, the nights grew unbearable. Residents reported knocks that came not at their doors, but from beneath their floors, echoing through the foundations of their homes. Radios turned on by themselves, broadcasting static threaded with faint whispers. One family abandoned their farmhouse entirely, after waking to find words carved into their walls, overnight words they swore had not been there before. "We hear you." The boy's father, broken with grief, took to wandering the fields at night. Neighbors watched from their windows as he trudged through the snow, calling his son's name, his voice carrying thin against the frozen air. One night he did not return. In the morning, his tracks were found leading into the center of a field, circling once, then stopping. There were no tracks leading back. The family was gone by spring. The house boarded up, the windows dark. The federal agents never came back. Their files disappeared, locked again in archives where no one could reach them. The sheriff, worn and hollow-eyed, stopped speaking of the case altogether. When asked, he would only mutter, "We tried, but you can't fight the land." Years passed, but the story lingered. Travelers who passed through town at night swore they saw figures in the fields, standing motionless against the snow. Truckers refused to stop on the long stretch of road where Michael Carr's car had once been found, headlights burning brighter as though to push back the dark. Children whispered the phrase in schoolyards like a curse, "The field is listening." And still the ground gave no answers. But the truth was there if anyone dared to look closely enough. It was in the skull, carved like an instrument. It was in the careful placement of the boy's shoe-folded denim. Michael's remains, arranged as though for a purpose. It was in Carr's own words, frantic yet clear. They are not taken away, they are absorbed. The land had not simply been a backdrop to his disappearance. It had been the antagonist. The silence of the fields was not emptiness, it was presence. Watching, listening, waiting. 3 decades after Michael Carr vanished and months after the boy was lost, the community came to understand a truth that was far worse than any answer they had sought. The missing had never left. Their voices lived in the static. Their knocks echoed through the wood of barns. Their bones rested beneath the soil carved into instruments through which the land could hear. The field did not bury them. It kept them. And every whisper of wind that passed through those fields carried a reminder. Once you are heard, you are never forgotten. The screen fades to black. The sound of wind builds, layered with faint knocks, then the hiss of static. Out of the static, a whisper emerges, not clear, not distinct, but enough to raise the hair on the back of the neck. Then silence.